Good evening, everyone. It is 5:30. Thank each of you for being here this evening. We will go ahead and start our pre-meeting discussion. This is a discussion around potential architectural review board. I know it has Commissioner Partee name beside it. Commissioner Partee, do you have anything to add before I turn it over to Mr. Semino?
Thank you, Mayor. No, just the fact that it has been brought to my attention from the communities that reside here in Huntersville. The question was, why do we not have a architectural review board? And I think we should just go over and explore and see what our planner, Jack Semino, has to tell us. But, I really like to state that, architecture reflects to me the unique character of a city, the town's culture, lifestyle, ethnicity, and security. And I think we should just explore and hear what our planner has to say. Thank you.
Mr. Semino.
So I'll go ahead and get started. That's not my first slide. Let's see here. Can anybody? Yeah. That's a second slide, and I can't forward it beyond that. What's that? There we go. Now we're cooking. Okay. All right. So I want to start with just give a basic understanding that we already today have some architectural controls. So I want to take a few moments just to talk a little bit about what we do today, and then talk about what we found in other communities that do have architectural review board. So Huntersville, back in 1996, adopted what we call a form-based code, and that code does not pay attention like normal conventional zoning ordinances with separating uses, commercial here, residential here, industrial here. Instead, the focus is on the relationship of the building facade to the public realm, the building to the street, as well as the form of the building and the mass of the building to one another. So that's baked into our code since 1996. So what do we mean by that? Next slide. It's not moving forward? Can you push that, Bobby? Just to explain a little bit about what that, just to show you exactly what we're talking about. Okay. The lights are on. Okay, that's not what I was talking about either. So there's photographs. It'd be helpful if we can just get this slide up with the photographs. There we go. So the photographs. Okay, and so can you get, there we go. So the top slide is a building that doesn't have any relationship to the street. It actually turns its back to the street. And the same view only except the building fronting a street, which our code has a requirement buildings front the street or an open space. So that's just one example of the public realm and how we pay attention to architecture. Another example in a downtown, the picture to the left is showing a blank wall, and then the picture on the right represents there's a door on the street, there's windows, and that too is also a component of our code, okay? So the thing about community appearance commissions and architectural design review board is go forward with caution. And Emily sent you an email just late today, but this is a blog from 2013, but it's still relevant, where the School of Government says move with caution. And basically, your architectural review board is not specifically authorized by the statute. They have community appearance boards, they have planning boards, historic preservation boards, but not an architectural review board. So proceed with caution. The other thing that's mentioned in here is when you start regulating architecture and taste, you can get very generic in nature, and so that can be fraught with legalities and enforcement. So proceed with caution. The entirety of the blog is included in the handout that I gave you, so you can kind of look at the whole blog and not just these words that have been highlighted by Emily. It does indicate there in this particular instance that, you know, if you have very well-conceived standards, you could administer it by the staff if they're concrete and specific enough. So I highlight some sections of the ordinance that deal with architecture. And so in Article 4, we list all the building types, that we have multiple different building types. And without getting into the details on the right, the kind of the highlights are, you know, this section talks about building materials. It talks about emphasizing the human scale, the windows on the street, the entrance on the street, the relationship of buildings with one another, transparent windows, et cetera. So this is actually part of the code in Article 4. You will also find in Article 3 in each of our zoning districts that we talk about how on existing streets, new buildings have to respect the general spacing of structures, building mass scale, and street frontage relationship of existing buildings. A says basically if you got a new building which adheres to all that, then it demonstrates compatibility. But B is the section that says new buildings which exceed the volume and the scale of existing buildings may demonstrate compatibility by varying the massing of the building to reduce perceived scale and volume. And then it goes on to talk about how you go to the definition of massing. So the point is, it's not saying you can't do these big buildings, but there are techniques that you use to make it blend, okay? And again, that is a key. It's not that everybody has to have the same size buildings. It's if you are a larger building and you're next to smaller buildings, you need to use different techniques. If you go to Article 12 of the zoning ordinance, you'll find the definition of massing, and it has all these different 11 elements that are listed with illustrations of what they're talking about. And so, you know, those are the key components of our ordinance that we use today. What I want to show you here is just an example of, you know, trying to fit in. So the first thing our ordinance talks about is how, you know, you have to have the human scale. So these things that I've highlighted, you know, you animate the ground floor, you got retail units, you got commercial uses down there. Your first floor is taller, and then your parking is not in the front, it's in the rear. So those are the kind of the components, if you will, that get to making things pedestrian friendly and oriented to the human scale. There's another section I highlighted up here which talks about kind of transitioning your building. So when you're a taller building next to a smaller building, it doesn't mean that you have to be the same size as your neighbor, but you step up, okay? And so those are things that we have in our code. The most recent example that we have, and even though we didn't spend a whole lot of time on this, but the fact of the matter, North Cross Hotel was a 4-story building. What happened was they set back, that top is the front, so they moved their 4th floor back to give it a 3-story scale, and then they changed the building architecture along the street front. And then on the back the rear, you see that also is 3 stories. You also notice it's a solid wall there because that was what was facing the residence. So the point I'm making is we look at architecture, even though we might not, in the scheme of things, there's so many things we talk about, you might not realize it, but that's an example of something that just recently went through that we talked about. So we looked at other communities, Charlotte, Concord, Matthews, Mooresville, Mount Holly, Pineville, Mint Hill do not have an architectural review board. However, Cornelius has an architectural review board, and Davidson has a design review board, and they do get involved in design review. So with Cornelius, there's 7 members, of which 4 have to have a design background. They review commercial buildings, apartments, and civic uses. The comment from us was they do provide valuable feedback from the staff, but it does lengthen the project timeline, not surprisingly so. Davidson is 9 members. They desire a design background and basically get that with their members. They review commercial and apartments and civic, much like Cornelius does. They too mentioned that they get valuable feedback from that group. And also it links in the timeline. Just so happens that their board also serves as a historic preservation board, and their meetings are quasi-judicial. The bottom line. So you can expect that the cost for the developer will go up. They're having to deal with this other board. They're going to have to provide drawings, there might be a back and forth, so, you know, you can expect a higher cost. The approval timeline will increase. I will say, if you have conditional zoning like us, it's a 4.5-month process, so we might be able to squeeze them in there. But if it's a commercial building in a commercial zone, it's not just a staff approval now, it's going to an architectural review board that will take time. I think it's fair to say that those that have it, those two communities say that they get useful feedback. There are some legal concerns that Emily pointed out to you. You can expect some extra costs from the town. In terms of the staffing, none of this stuff comes easy. It takes staffing time, which is time is money. And then establishing development guidelines that are clear. And so this is just an example of one. This happens to be one little snippet I got out of it. I think it was a 48-page booklet of, you know, what are they looking for? So that is a really quick overview of where we're at. Emily is here to answer questions. I'm here to answer questions, feedback, anything that you know, you want to talk about, we're ready to discuss. And that's it.
I would ask Ms. Loop if you would talk a little bit about the legal concerns, and then we'll open it up for conversation. Discussion.
So you all should have received an email from me today that was essentially making a point of clarification regarding statutory authority for architectural review boards. Long story short, the statutes, Chapter 160D in particular, does not provide specific authority to have an architectural review board. There is specific authority for multiple other boards, including the Planning Board, Board of Adjustment, and all of the boards that Jack described. And when you have specific authority for those boards, there's usually a corresponding section that provides specific duties that can be assigned to those boards. Given that we don't have specific authority to create an architectural review board, we would have to rely on Section 160D 306. And that section allows for general, not specific, authority to create by ordinance other advisory boards. Those boards would only be advisory in nature. They cannot make final decisions. And another caveat to that is that when you have general authority rather than specific, you can't exceed the purpose and grant of authority for the zoning regulations themselves. And those are set forth at 160D 701 and 702. You should have a copy of those that Jack provided. And if you read through those sections, the purpose and the general grant of authority do not touch upon aesthetics or regulating aesthetics. In fact, Section 160D 702 specifically says that you cannot regulate for residential buildings design elements as defined by statute. Furthermore, Jack should have included a blog by a subject matter expert from UNC School of Government. That blog heavily cautions against creating boards that are making decisions on subjective aesthetic type design questions. And that is, again, going back to the fact that we don't have specific authority to create such boards. As to another note that was made in that blog by the professor, he points to an alternate method of achieving essentially the same purpose that has been upheld by North Carolina courts. And that alternate mechanism for regulating aesthetics is using form-based code, which, as Jack mentioned, we're already doing here in Huntersville.
Ms. Loop, since Cornelius and Davidson do have some form, are we aware of any potential lawsuits that they have endured?
Well, as to the lawsuits, I'm not 100% because I have not looked into that, but I would point out that whereas while Davidson and Cornelius both have boards that are entitled Architectural Review Board or Design Review Board, their bylaws and rules of procedure for the authority to create such boards goes back to Planning Board for Cornelius and Community Appearance Commissions for Davidson. And so technically, those boards should be limiting themselves to duties that are allowed for those types of boards in the statutes. So for example, if they're citing to in their rules of procedure, or bylaws, I guess I should say, for Davidson, that they are forming the board pursuant to the Community Appearance Commission grant of authority, they should not be exercising duties that are not authorized for community appearance commissions. So if they exceed that scope of authority, that could cause litigation.
Do either of those communities have form-based code?
Jack would be better to speak to
Yes,
that.
they've had it since the 90s, just like Huntersville. As a matter of fact, Huntersville, Cornelius, and Davidson all adopted the codes at around the same time in 96, 95, 96.
Any other questions from the board? Commissioner Boone?
Thank you. I got a couple of questions. Now, if somebody wants to do something to their home, do they have to bring their plans instead of the HOA? Is that one step, and then the town review board? How does that work?
Yeah, so first, all single-family and duplex dwelling units are exempt from any kind of architectural standard. So that's state statute across all of North Carolina. Does that answer the question?
It does? Then I would like to know if you could give me a definition of form-based zoning like we have in Huntersville versus traditional.
So that was kind of like the first slide, it was general. I can give you a more detailed definition. But basically, a conventional code pays attention to separation of land uses, commercial, industrial, residential. And they don't care what the buildings look like and what the street front looks like. I say that, but they not the same as a form-based code. Form-based code says your building needs to orient to the street, you need a public entrance on the street, it needs to architecturally blend with your neighbors in terms of the scale and the massing, not the building, you know, not that this is a Craftsman style and this is a Victorian style and you got to match with that. It's the scale and the massing of the building. And I apologize, but that's kind of the short version of the kind of the comparison of the two.
Okay, thanks, Jack.
Any other questions for Mr. Semino? Commissioner Munger?
Sure. One of the things you pointed out was Davidson's Architectural Review Board is quasi-judicial. That seems to run counter to what Ms. Sloop had mentioned about it not having the authority. Can you explain, I guess, why it is quasi-judicial and what they're able to do as a quasi-judicial board?
I do not have the details of that. I mean, in terms of a planning board can have quasi-judicial meetings by the statute, but I do not have specifics. And if there are any questions that you have that I can get information and follow up, I'm happy to do that with that question.
Any other questions? Commissioner Kidwell?
This is just a general question. But 6 weeks ago, this was on the agenda for the planning, our retreat. And then at 4:30 today, we get an email saying how we pretty much can't do it. We can, but we can't. You know, why did it take 6 weeks to get that information to us an hour before the pre-meeting?
I will let Mr. Roberts answer that question.
So we just, put this on the agenda. I think you had, Commissioner Kidwell, you had some questions on maybe HOAB, possibly, I can't remember which one. And then I think Mr. Partee, Commissioner Partee had on ARB. Recent conversations with you were to drop your HOAB, you were fine. And then Mr. Partee, Commissioner Partee sent in some questions over the weekend on maybe some things to address. To me and Jack. Jack addressed those. Emily was not aware of those. I actually forwarded those to her today so that she could maybe have some input. So that could potentially be my fault, but we didn't know what y'all wanted to discuss, to be honest with you. Didn't know where you wanted to go with HOAB. I didn't know exactly where Mr. Partee wanted to go with ARB. So once we got those questions, we were able to send those to Jack and get his feedback, and then I shared those with Emily today. So it's kind of tough for me to give you too much when I didn't know where it was going, to be honest with you.
Commissioner Munger?
I am curious why we decided we weren't going to talk about all the boards specifically during the retreat, we were going to have a discussion on all the boards, and somehow that died off and became only Architectural Review Board. Was Commissioner Kidwell the only one who had an interest in that? Because I know I had an interest in discussing all of the boards.
We started out with all of the boards, sort of, you could discuss all of them. If I recall on the, at the planning/budget workshop, we had it sort of listed as all general boards. So you could kind of bring up whatever you wanted to. And then as we got further down the line, I'd reached out to Mr. Kidwell, Commissioner Kidwell, and Commissioner Partee, because they specifically mentioned ARB and HOAB, if I recall. And then once it dropped, we dropped back to ARB. But we can add it back to a future agenda and have whatever discussion you like. But if you want research, any detail, just let us know so that we make sure staff can get you whatever information you like.
I would agree with you, Mr. Roberts. Board, if you want to have the conversations, please make sure that you're asking questions to help staff understand what they need to bring to the table for these conversations, because we spin our wheels otherwise. Anything else? Any other questions at this point? Okay. Well, then, seeing none, we have about 10 minutes before 6 p.m., so we will adjourn for now and come back at 6.